The old man in the mansion tipped me $3 every single Thursday for 3 years. Not 10, not 20, 3. At first, I thought he was the cheapest rich man I had ever met. I would drive up that long gravel driveway, past the iron gates and the perfectly trimmed hedges, and carry a medium pepperoni pizza to the front door of a house that probably cost more than I would make in 15 lifetimes. And every time, Howard Blackwood would hand me exact change plus 3 crumpled dollar bills like he was doing me some special favor. The guys at the pizzeria used to laugh about it. "You got the Blackwood order again? That old man tips worse than broke freshmen." I always shrugged and said, "At least he's consistent." But it bothered me. Not only because I needed the money, even though I did. It bothered me because I couldn't figure him out. I thought I understood wealthy people. Some were generous because they could afford to be. Others were stingy because that was how they stayed rich. Howard Blackwood was neither. He was something quieter than that, something harder to read. Every Thursday at exactly 7:15 p.m., he ordered the same medium pepperoni pizza. Every Thursday, he answered the door himself. And every Thursday, he looked at me just a little too long before asking something small. "Cold out there tonight. You staying warm? Busy shift? You holding up, son?" Nothing personal, nothing direct, just enough to leave me unsettled on the drive back to town. I had no idea those $3 were never about money. They were a message, a private language from a man who had spent too much of his life being afraid. Howard Blackwood was my grandfather, my father's father, and he had been watching me from a distance my entire life without ever telling me who he was. I found out 3 weeks after the last pizza I ever delivered to that house. To understand why it shook me the way it did, you need to understand what my life looked like before that day. My name is Daniel Carter. I was 24 years old, living in a narrow rental duplex with a leaky bathroom faucet and a refrigerator that hummed like it was angry to still be alive. I had been delivering pizzas for Marino's on the east side of Charleston since I was 19. 5 years of late nights, cheap gas station coffee, wet pizza bags, impatient customers, and the same 3 neighborhoods I could have driven blindfolded. It was not the life I had imagined when I was younger, but it was the life I had. For a while I told myself that was enough. Marino's was one of those places that had survived long enough to become part of the town's bloodstream. Faded red booths, old photographs on the wall, a bell over the front door that rang too loudly every time someone walked in. Sal Marino had opened the place in the late 70s. His son Nico ran it now with the tired patience of a man who had inherited both a business and a permanent headache. He gave me a job when I had no degree, no real plan, and no references worth mentioning. I respected him for that. My mother respected him too, because stable work mattered to people who had spent most of their lives one accident away from disaster. My mother, Elaine Carter, was a nurse at the county hospital. She had worked night shifts, double shifts, holiday shifts, the kind of shifts that hollow a person out slowly and then dare them to keep standing. She always kept standing. I gave her more of my paycheck than she ever asked for, and she always pretended to argue before accepting it. That was the rhythm of our life. Small sacrifices, quiet love, no room for self-pity. I grew up without a father, which is not unusual, but it leaves a shape inside you, an outline, a blank space you spend years pretending not to feel. I asked about him once when I was 7. My mother froze for half a second, then smiled in a way that told me I had stepped onto dangerous ground. "He had to go away before you were born," she said. "It's just us now, sweetheart, and we are enough." I loved her too much to ask again. But not asking and not wondering are different things. I wondered all the time. I wondered every time another kid got picked up from baseball practice by a father who shouted encouragement through the car window. I wondered every time a teacher handed out some Father's Day craft project and tried too hard not to look at me. I wondered when I was 13 and started noticing that my face looked like no one else's in our family photo albums. Wondering became background noise, a low ache, something I stopped naming because naming it made it worse. So yes, by the time Howard Blackwood entered my life, I was already carrying an absence. I just didn't know his house sat at the far edge of it. The Blackwood estate was hard to miss. Even if you had never been there, people in town knew the name. Old money, timber, shipping, real estate, the kind of family that had buildings named after them and scandals buried beneath charity banquets. Their mansion sat beyond a private road lined with hedges so perfectly trimmed they looked artificial. The first time I delivered there, I was nervous in the ordinary way you're nervous whenever wealth becomes architecture. I expected a butler, or a housekeeper, or some smooth, impatient man in a cardigan who would take the pizza without meeting my eyes. Instead, the door opened, and there stood Howard Blackwood himself. Tall, silver-haired, a little stooped, but not frail. He had the kind of face age sometimes gives men who have spent too much of their lives making decisions other people had to live with. Not cruel, not kind either, just heavy. He took the box with both hands, like it mattered. Then he looked at me in a way no customer ever did. He actually looked. "Thank you, son," he said. Then he handed me exact change and $3. I remember driving away from that first delivery irritated and weirdly unsettled. He had been polite, more than polite. But something about him lingered. After the third or fourth week, I started expecting it. After 6 months, I could predict the shape of the exchange before I even reached the porch. He would open the door almost immediately, as if he had been standing nearby waiting. He would ask one small question. Sometimes he would glance at my car, my jacket, my face, like he was checking for signs of wear. Once, during a thunderstorm so bad I had almost expected him to cancel, he opened the door and said, "Terrible night to be out on the roads." I laughed and told him that pizza didn't stop for weather. He almost smiled. "No," he said quietly. "Life rarely does." At the time, I took it as old man philosophy. Nothing more. Another time, he asked if I liked the work. I told him it paid the bills. He nodded as if that answer hurt him. Once, on my birthday, though I hadn't told anyone at the mansion and the pizzeria definitely hadn't, he stood there with the pizza in his hands and said, "You're 24 today, aren't you?" I stared at him. He seemed to realize what he had done and corrected himself almost instantly. Or near enough. "You look older than boys your age. That's all I meant." I let it go, but the whole drive back I felt cold under my skin. There were other things too. Small things. Strange things. During December, he gave me the usual $3 plus a scarf folded inside a paper bag, dark gray wool, expensive enough that I knew immediately he hadn't bought it by accident. "For the weather," he said. I didn't know whether to refuse. In the end, I thanked him and took it. That night, my mother held the scarf in her hands and went very still. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "A customer." "Which customer?" "Just an old man on Wexler Hill." She nodded too quickly and handed it back. "Well," she said, "it's nice." I didn't know then that she had recognized the name before I ever did. The last pizza I ever delivered to Howard Blackwood was on a Thursday in late October. Cool air, clear sky. The kind of evening Charleston gets a few times a year when even old neighborhoods look dignified. He opened the door slower than usual. He looked tired. More than tired. As if he had spent the day climbing stairs no one else could see. When he handed me the money, the 3 $1 bills were folded with unusual care. His hand trembled. "You all right?" I asked before I could stop myself. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face changed. Not softened. Opened, maybe. "Not entirely," he said, "but I am glad to see you." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. I drove away feeling like I had left something unfinished behind me. 3 weeks later, Howard died quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday morning. I would not even have heard about it if his attorney, Leonard Vail, hadn't called me 2 days later. His voice was calm, precise, expensive. "Mr. Carter," he said, "Mr. Blackwood left very specific instructions concerning you." I actually laughed. "Are you sure you have the right person? I'm just the pizza guy." "There is no mistake," he said. "Please come to my office tomorrow at noon." I showed up wearing the best clothes I owned, which wasn't saying much. Dark jeans without holes. A button-down shirt I had ironed that morning. Leonard Vail's office looked exactly the way serious money smells. Polished wood, leather chairs, silence. There were no family photographs on the walls, no clutter, no warmth, just law, arranged in straight lines. He slid a thick envelope across the desk. "Mr. Blackwood asked that this be given to you only after his death and only in person." Inside were two things: a small brass key and a folded document. I opened the document first. It was a DNA report. My name was printed on one side, Daniel Carter. On the other side was a name I had never seen before, Adrian Blackwood. At the bottom, in bold letters, was one word: match. I stared at it until the letters stopped feeling real. "Who is Adrian Blackwood?" I asked. Leonard removed his glasses and folded them carefully on the desk. Adrian Blackwood was Howard's younger son. He died in a car accident in September of 2001, 1 month before you were born. The room shifted under me. I gripped the arm of the chair. "You're telling me he was my father?" "Yes, my father. The ghost at the edge of every school form, every awkward Father's Day, every half-finished answer I had given people my whole life. He had a name, Adrian Blackwood, and he had been dead before I was born. The old man who gave me $3 every Thursday had known exactly who I was every time I stood on his porch." "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked. Leonard sighed. "That answer may be with whatever the key opens." Before I could say another word, the office door opened hard. A man in his 50s walked in, flushed with anger, with a woman just behind him wearing the kind of expression that had never made room for doubt or mercy. "This is ridiculous," the man snapped. "You expect us to believe my father left something to a delivery driver?" Leonard remained seated. Mr. Blackwood's instructions were clear. The woman stepped forward and looked at me the way people look at dirt on polished shoes. "You are not family," she said. "You are an inconvenience." The man's suit was expensive and cut too tightly across his shoulders, like he wore anger under it. "My name is Victor Blackwood," he said, as if that should end the conversation. "And whatever game this is, it ends now." "This is not a game," Leonard said, "and I suggest you both leave." Victor laughed once, harshly. "My father dies and suddenly some pizza boy appears with a story? You expect me to stand by while you hand pieces of our family to a stranger?" "The DNA results are conclusive," Leonard said, "and your father's personal records support them." Victor looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it land. Not acceptance, recognition. Something in my face had betrayed the truth before any paper did. That seemed to make him angrier. The woman, his wife, I assumed, tilted her head and asked, "Did he coach you? Is that what this is? Did the old man get sentimental and decide to collect mistakes before he died?" I hadn't come there for money. I hadn't come there for property. I had come because a dead old man had asked me to. But standing there, looking at the hatred in their faces, I understood something right away. Whatever this was, it had been waiting for me a long time. I drove straight to my mother's house. She was still in her scrubs when I walked in, standing in the kitchen cutting vegetables for dinner. Elaine Carter had been a nurse for almost 20 years, and even tired, she carried herself like someone who had learned how to survive without help. She smiled when she saw me. That smile disappeared when I placed the DNA report and the brass key on the table. The knife slipped from her hand. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Howard Blackwood's lawyer." She sat down slowly, as if her knees no longer trusted the floor. "He knew, Mom. He knew the whole time. And if he knew, then you knew too." For a long moment she said nothing. Then the tears came. My mother was not a woman who cried easily. I had seen her cry twice in my life before that day. Once when her sister died. Once when she thought I couldn't hear her after opening a hospital bill we couldn't pay. Seeing her break open like that scared me more than the DNA report had. She told me everything. Adrian Blackwood had been 23 when they met. She had been working at a diner outside Charleston, South Carolina, and he came in every morning for coffee. He was reckless, charming, and careless in the way some rich young men are careless, as if life had never truly forced them to account for anything. But with her, she said, he had been different, softer, serious in the ways that mattered. He came back because he wanted to see her. Then he came back because he needed to. Then one day he stayed after closing and helped her stack chairs just to keep talking. They fell in love fast. "Too fast," she said, with a smile that looked painful even now. The kind that feels holy when you're inside it and foolish when you try to explain it later. They met in parking lots and quiet diners, and once at a bookstore halfway between town and the coast, where no one knew either of them. He talked about leaving his family business, about wanting to build something with his own hands, about how suffocating money could be when it came attached to expectations. She listened because she believed him. I think part of her still did. When she told him she was pregnant, he panicked. Then he promised he would make it right. He told her he was going to speak to his family. He told her he wanted to marry her. He kissed her forehead and said, "I don't want our child growing up like a secret." A week later, he was dead. My mother went to the funeral anyway. She stood in the back and said nothing. After the service, Howard's wife, Eleanor, pulled her aside and told her if she ever came near the Blackwood family again, she would ruin her. Said she had trapped Adrian. Said she was the reason he was dead. Said people like her should know their place. "Howard was there," my mother said quietly. "He didn't say those words, but he didn't stop her either." My mother was 24, pregnant, broke, alone. So she disappeared. She changed back to her maiden name, moved to another town. Raised me by herself, never looked back, or tried not to. "A few years ago," she said quietly, "I got a letter with no return address. It said, 'I know about the boy. I am sorry. I will make it right.' I never answered. I looked at the key. He found a way to watch, didn't he?" She nodded once. "I think he did." I thought about the old man's eyes, the way he lingered in the doorway, the way he asked if I was warm, if I was doing all right, as if those were the only questions he was allowed to ask. "I have to know," I said. My mother took a breath and wiped her face. "Then be careful. People like that don't like being reminded of what they buried." That night I barely slept. Every memory had rearranged itself. Howard's questions, the scarf, the strange way he said son. Even the $3 had changed shape in my mind. They were no longer insulting. They were intimate, which somehow hurt worse. I kept thinking about how close he had stood to the truth for 3 years and still chose the safety of ritual over the risk of honesty. By morning, anger had joined the grief. The next morning, Leonard gave me an address, a private storage facility about 20 minutes outside Charleston. Howard had rented Unit 21C for nearly 16 years, paid cash every year, told no one. The brass key fit the padlock. The metal door rattled upward, and warm, stale air met me first. Inside were boxes, a desk, a banker's lamp, and on that desk sat an envelope with my name written across it in a shaky hand. I opened it standing there. The letter was 6 pages long. It began simply, Dear Daniel, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I owe you the truth. Howard wrote that Adrian had come to his study the night before he died and told him everything. Told him he was in love. Told him he was going to become a father. Told him he was finally ready to grow into the man he should have been. Howard wrote that he had told his son he was proud of him. Those were the last words he ever spoke to him. Then the accident came, and grief turned his wife cruel. She blamed my mother, blamed me, forced Howard to choose between acknowledging us and destroying what remained of his marriage and family. He chose silence. He called himself a coward more than once. He admitted that he hired a private investigator to follow my life from a distance. He had photographs of me at 7, 10, 15, 18, my first day of school, my graduation, copies of report cards, notes from teachers, newspaper clippings, proof of a life he had watched but never touched. He wrote about seeing me once at 16 at a grocery store with my mother and nearly speaking to us before losing his nerve. He wrote about sending money anonymously twice and panicking when it was returned. He wrote about attending my high school graduation from the far back row, leaving before I could ever know he had been there. Each sentence made me feel both loved and robbed. Then I got to the part that made me stop reading and close my eyes. When you began delivering pizzas to my home, I believed God was giving me one last chance. I was too afraid to tell you the truth, but I could see you. I could hear your voice. I could ask whether you were well and pretend for a moment that I had not forfeited my place in your life. Then came the part about the $3. The $3 tip was never about the money. In 1971, a slice of pie and coffee cost $3 at the diner where I took your grandmother on our first date. It was my way of remembering what love once felt like before fear made a coward of me. It was also my way of speaking to you when I no longer trusted myself to say the words plainly. By the time I reached the final page, my hands were shaking. But the letter did not end with apology. It ended with instructions. Inside the boxes, Howard wrote, I would find evidence of who I was, and means to live differently if I chose. He wrote that none of it could repay silence. He wrote that inheritance without truth was just another form of control, and he did not wish to die controlling me. Then he signed it, not Howard, not Mr. Blackwood, but simply grandfather, if you can forgive the word. I stood there for a long time after reading that line. Then I began opening boxes. In the first I found legal records, investigator files, photos of me growing up, documentation proving paternity, a leather-bound journal with years of entries, many of them about me. In another I found copies of every birthday card he had apparently written and never sent. Some were awkward, some were unbearably tender. At 12, I am told boys your age begin to believe they do not need anyone. I hope that is not true. At 17, you look so much like Adrian when you are not smiling. At 23, if I speak now, I may tear open wounds your mother worked hard to close. If I remain silent, I continue the same cruelty in a gentler form. I no longer know which sin is smaller. In the final box, I found financial documents. A trust statement in my name worth $875,000, and the deed to a lakeside cabin on Silver Birch Lake, a place that had belonged to the Blackwood family for generations. There were also handwritten notes from Howard about why he chose the cabin. Not because it was the most valuable property, but because Adrian had loved it. Because, according to the note, he once said he wanted to bring Elaine there and ask her to marry him on the porch at sunset. I sat down on the concrete floor and cried. Not because of the money, not because of the cabin. Because for 24 years I had lived with an empty space inside me, and in a storage unit full of dust and cardboard, I found proof that someone had loved me all along, imperfectly, secretly, too late. But still, I didn't tell anyone about the trust that first day, not even my mother. I drove straight to the lake instead. Silver Birch was about 90 minutes away, tucked behind a long two-lane road and a fringe of pines so dense the light changed once you entered them. The cabin sat back from the water, cedar-sided, modest, deeply still. It was smaller than I expected for Blackwood property, which made me trust it more. The porch faced the lake. Two old rocking chairs sat beside a table ringed with water stains. One of the chairs had a split in the arm, repaired years ago with care instead of replacement. Inside, the place smelled like cedar, books, and old summers. There were blankets folded in a wooden chest, framed photographs on the mantel, and a fishing rod in the corner like someone had only stepped out for a moment decades ago. I walked through those rooms with the quiet awe of someone moving through a memory that didn't quite belong to him and yet did. In the second bedroom closet, I found an old flannel jacket and a pair of boots. On the bookshelf, a row of veterinary manuals with Adrian's initials on the inside cover. On the back of one photo frame, in faded ink, someone had written, "Adrian, age 16, pretending he hates the lake." I held that photograph longer than I should have. There was something unbearable about recognizing pieces of yourself in a dead stranger's posture. My mother came with me a week later. When she stepped onto the porch, she froze. "He told me about this place," she said softly. "Only once. Like it was dangerous to say out loud." She touched the railing as if she were touching a ghost. Then she cried, the quiet kind that looks like surrender. We stayed until sunset. It felt like trespassing and belonging at the same time. The legal battle started almost immediately. Howard's older son, Victor Blackwood, and his wife, Celeste, challenged everything. They claimed I had manipulated an old man in the final years of his life. They said I was a fraud. They said I had no right to the Blackwood name. They implied my mother had orchestrated the whole thing, which told me they were still the same family they had always been. Leonard Vail had been ready for them. Howard had spent years assembling proof they could not break. The DNA results, the investigator records, journal entries in Howard's own hand, financial records showing the trust had been established long before I even knew the truth, private letters, notes about Adrian, notes about me, notes filled with guilt. There were even surveillance logs showing that Howard had been paying to keep track of my academic records and emergency medical history from a distance, not in a predatory way, but in the way of a man who had reduced love to administration because it felt safer than presence. Victor's lawyers tried to suggest coercion, diminished capacity, tampering. Leonard dismantled them with the patience of a man cutting wire one strand at a time. Howard's physician testified that he had remained mentally sharp until the end. A financial trustee testified that the fund in my name had been established 12 years earlier. Not impulsive, not sentimental, deliberate, long-term, planned. The judge looked tired by the end of the second hearing. Victor looked offended by the very existence of facts. Celeste looked like someone calculating how much dignity it would cost her to lose gracefully, then deciding not to pay it. The judge dismissed their challenge faster than they expected. Howard Blackwood had acted legally, deliberately, clearly. I was recognized as his grandson. The trust was mine. The cabin was mine. And for the first time in my life, the truth was no longer something other people could keep from me. Outside the courthouse, Victor caught up with me on the steps. His face was red with humiliation. "You think this makes you one of us?" he said. "You are still just a delivery boy." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I remembered one of Howard's journal entries Leonard had shown me during the case. A line about Victor calling only when he needed money. A line about loneliness. A line about how some people inherit everything and still never learn how to love. "Maybe," I said. "But I showed up." He frowned. "For 3 years," I said. "I stood on his porch every Thursday. I looked him in the eye. I spoke to him with decency. I treated him like a person. I did that without knowing he was family. You knew exactly who he was, and you still abandoned him. That's the difference between us." Something flickered in his face then. Not remorse. I don't think he had enough practice for that. But maybe recognition. Maybe shame. It vanished quickly. He stepped closer and said, "You have no idea what it takes to carry a family like ours." I almost laughed. "No," I said. "But I know what it costs when nobody does." He didn't answer. He couldn't. A week later, I took my mother to the cabin on Silver Birch Lake again. This time we stayed overnight. She made tea in the kitchen while I built a fire badly enough to make her smile for the first time in days. We sat on the porch afterward, wrapped in blankets, watching the lake turn black under the sky. "Adrian used to talk about a place like this," she said. "He said it was the only place he ever felt calm." I stood beside her. "Then maybe some part of him made it here anyway." She leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. "I'm sorry I kept the truth from you. You were trying to keep me safe." "I was trying," she said. "I just didn't know what it would cost." Neither did I. But for the first time, the cost was behind us. In the months that followed, my life began to change in ways that felt both dramatic and strangely practical. I didn't become a different man overnight. Money doesn't do that. Not really. It just removes certain humiliations quickly enough that you finally notice how many of them you had accepted as normal. I paid off my mother's debts first. All of them. Hospital bills, credit cards, the loan on her car. She cried again when I told her, then got angry, then cried harder because anger had always been her way of protecting gratitude from becoming weakness. I replaced her car with something safe and boring and reliable, which made her happiest. I fixed the bathroom in my duplex before realizing I no longer needed to live in my duplex. I gave Nico at Marino's a month's notice because leaving without respect would have felt like betraying the people who held me up before blood ever did. He looked at me when I told him and said, "You always did look like a guy who was waiting for a door to open." "Maybe," I said. "Maybe I just didn't know it yet." I did not tell everyone about the inheritance. Towns like ours turn news into appetite too quickly. I said I was going back to school, which was true. Howard had been a veterinarian before taking over family business obligations, and Adrian had apparently planned to follow him before life bent in other directions. Buried in Howard's journals were notes about how I used to help injured birds as a kid, how I once spent grocery money on antibiotics for a stray dog when I was 14. I had no memory of how he knew that, and that unsettled me. But he was right. Animals had always made sense to me in a way people often did not. So I enrolled in prerequisites at the local college. It felt ridiculous at first. Then it felt like hunger finally finding the correct table. Not everything healed cleanly. There were days when I hated Howard, days when the journals felt less like love and more like evidence of theft. He had watched me learn to shave, graduate, fail, recover, break down, survive, and never once stepped forward when it still could have mattered in the ordinary daily way children need adults to matter. A trust fund could not sit beside a hospital bed. A cabin could not teach a boy how to take a punch without becoming cruel. Sometimes I would be reading one of his entries and suddenly have to close the book because tenderness from a coward is still a kind of wound. But grief is rarely pure. It came braided. Love, anger, gratitude, disgust. Some days I missed him even though I never truly had him. Some evenings I would think about the last Thursday, the way he said he was glad to see me, and it would hit me with such force that I had to sit down. I began visiting his grave in secret, not because I was sentimental, because I needed somewhere to put the arguments I could no longer have. The Blackwood family plot sat under live oaks in an old cemetery where wealth had been aging elegantly for generations. Howard's stone was simple by family standards. Name, dates, beloved father, grandfather. I stood there the first time with my hands in my coat pockets and said, out loud, "You should have told me." The wind moved through the trees. That was all. But I kept going back. Sometimes I talked. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I left 3 $1 bills at the base of the stone and hated myself for the gesture even as I made it. My mother eventually met Leonard for coffee without telling me first. When she admitted it, I expected anger and found only curiosity. "I wanted to know if Howard ever loved Adrian the way he claimed he did," she said. "And?" "He did," she said quietly. "Just not bravely." That stayed with me. It explained more people than I wanted it to. There is a certain kind of damage that doesn't come from lack of feeling, but from lack of courage. It wears a respectable face. It tells itself that delay is wisdom, that silence is mercy, that protection excuses absence. It lets years pass while calling itself careful. Howard had loved me. I no longer doubted that. But love without risk had turned him into a spectator at his own life, and that was the inheritance I refused to keep. The next summer, after my first semester back in school, I drove to Silver Birch alone and stayed for 6 days. I repaired a loose porch board, cleaned out the shed, read Adrian's old books, swam once at dusk in water so cold it felt like starting over. On the 4th night, I found an old cassette recorder in a drawer beneath the desk in the back room. I almost left it alone. Then I found the tapes. Most were unlabeled. On one, in Howard's handwriting, were the words Adrian, July 2001. I sat on the floor beside the recorder and pressed play. There was static first, then laughter. Male, young, unguarded. My chest tightened before I even knew why. Then a voice said, "If you're recording this to prove I'm lazy, I object." Another voice, Howard's, younger but unmistakable, answered, "I am recording this because one day you may pretend you never listened to me." Adrian laughed again. They were at the cabin, I realized. You could hear water behind them, wind, a screen door. For 20 minutes I listened to my father exist, not as a fact, not as a tragedy, as a man. He teased Howard about fishing, complained about mosquitoes, said he was thinking of leaving Charleston for good, said there was someone he wanted Howard to meet, said with shy certainty I could hear even through time, "I think I'm going to marry her." I stopped the tape then because I couldn't breathe properly. It is a strange thing to hear the dead before they become dead. Stranger still when the voice sounds enough like your own that it feels like you are being haunted from inside your own mouth. That night I sat on the porch until dawn and understood something I hadn't before. Howard had not only left me money, he had left me continuity. Evidence that I came from real people who laughed and hesitated and loved badly and meant well too late. That did not excuse what had been done to my mother or to me. But it did rescue my father from abstraction. He was no longer just the name on a DNA report. He had a voice. Once I had that, I could no longer live as if my life were simply something that happened to me. I do not mean that everything became noble after that. I was still 24, still capable of self-pity, still stupid in ordinary ways. I bought a pair of boots I didn't need because they looked like the kind of boots a man with direction might own. I took my mother to a restaurant where the napkins were too expensive to use correctly. I signed papers with a steadier hand than I felt. I learned that wealth attracts old acquaintances and new manipulations. I also learned that some people will never forgive you for becoming harder to place in the hierarchy they preferred. Victor never spoke to me again after the courthouse. Celeste sent one cold, impeccably worded note through Leonard requesting certain family photographs from the cabin. I sent back copies of those that included her children and none of the originals. Leonard later told me that Howard would have approved. Maybe. Or maybe that was just Leonard being kind. By autumn, I was working fewer hours, studying more, and driving to the lake whenever the noise in my head became too crowded. Sometimes I imagined what would have happened if Howard had answered the door one Thursday and simply said, "Daniel, come in. There is something I need to tell you." Maybe I would have hated him for the timing. Maybe my mother would have slammed every door he tried to open. Maybe Victor would still have contested everything, only earlier. But at least the truth would have entered the room while he was still alive to bear its consequences. That is the part I still cannot forgive. He wanted forgiveness arranged around his absence. Life does not always permit that. And yet, for all my anger, I keep the $3 bills. Not the original ones, those went toward gas or groceries like everything else back then. But I keep 3 singles folded inside the back of Howard's final letter. Not as reverence, as warning. About what happens when feeling replaces action for too long. About what a man can reduce love to when courage leaves the room. I used to think family was blood. Then I thought family was sacrifice. Now I think family is presence. It is who shows up before the funeral. It is who chooses discomfort over distance. It is who risks being hated in the short term rather than disappearing in the long one. Howard Blackwood loved me. I believe that. My mother loved me. I never had to doubt it. Adrian, from everything I have gathered, would have loved me too, had he been given the chance to stay alive long enough to prove it. But love alone is not the whole story. It never was. Presence matters. Truth matters. Courage matters. Without them, love becomes another locked room full of unopened letters. My name is Daniel Carter. For years I was the pizza guy who drove up a long gravel driveway and wondered why an old man in a mansion looked at him like he was remembering something painful. Then I learned I was a Blackwood. Then I learned that names matter less than choices. I inherited money, a cabin, a stack of journals, a dead father's voice on cassette, and a grandfather's remorse. But what changed my life was not the inheritance. It was the answer to the question I had been carrying since childhood. Where do I come from? I come from a waitress who chose survival. I come from a young man who meant to do right and died before he could prove it. I come from an old man who loved late and feared deeply. I come from silence, yes, but not only silence. I also come from endurance. And now, when I think about Howard standing at that front door with a pizza in one hand and $3 in the other, I do not think of a cheap old man anymore. I think of a man who had built a life large enough to hide inside and still died wishing he had been braver. I think of how close he stood to the truth every Thursday and how little finally separated us. A porch, a pizza box, $3, a word he never said. And I think of the life I have now, the one I am building with my eyes open, and I know this much. Whatever else I inherited from that family, I will not inherit their silence.